Hey guys, this is Amelia. I know that some of you prefer short clips, so I'm breaking my episode, Deprogramming the Left Inside the Mind of a Modern Cult, into 3 parts. This is part 1 of 3. If at any point you decide you want to watch the full episode, you can find the link in the description box below. So tell me what you think. Have the woke become the new Puritans?
Are you a good witch or a bad witch?
A baby.
We stand trial today on Cleda Dunn, accused of 17 counts of witchcraft. How do you plead?
Not guilty, Your Honor.
I saw her turn into a puff of smoke.
She cast a spell on my wife and children.
Yeah, and she opened my pickle jar when I couldn't get it open.
Witch!
That is cute, but the thing about witch trials is they're not funny.
You've been accused of a crime you did not commit. It's impossible to prove your innocence. If you insist that you're innocent anyway, you'll likely be found guilty and executed. But if you confess, apologize, and implicate others for good measure, you'll go free. Do you give a false confession or risk a public hanging? This was the choice facing those accused of witchcraft in the village of Salem, Massachusetts, between February 1692 and May 1693.
I've always been drawn to the story of Salem, and that's because it's a mirror. Every generation resurrects it to tell a story about itself. In the leftist imagination, it's become a stage for our favorite morality tales. For the atheists, the witch trials have symbolized religious hysteria fashioned as proof of Christianity at its most backwards and irrational. For feminists, Salem became patriarchy incarnate, a tale of outspoken women silenced by men, with Hester Prynne from the Scarlet Letter held up as the archetype of the condemned woman forced to wear society's shame. In the 20th century, Arthur Miller's The Crucible recast it as McCarthyism, making witch hunt shorthand for conservatives persecuting leftists. Because of this, most of us know that calling someone puritanical has become a kind of slur for a dogmatic, finger-wagging moralizer who irrationally persecutes others simply for living by a different set of values. In his book, The New Puritans, Andrew Doyle breathes new life into the insults by turning the mirror back on the modern left, arguing that the woke embody the same spirit today. In his book, he says, quote, "Yet the analogy of the New Puritans is useful mostly because of what the concept of Puritanism has come to represent. Theirs is a belief in the perfectibility of humankind. The objective is not to critique society as it is, but to engineer an entirely fresh pseudo-reality through the imposition of limitations on language, thoughts, and perception. They seek to publicly shame those they consider dissidents and condemn all those who stray from the righteous path. Every day on social media there is a fresh Hester Prynne to force on the pillory steps. There are all sorts of ways in which lies gain currency. The hysteria of Salem is just one of the more evocative historical instances of people collectively fabricating a false reality and punishing those who fail to attest to its veracity. We are living through a period in which, much like the days when religious convictions were generally uncontested, articles of faith are peddled as truths by those in positions of power. The New Puritans, then, are best understood as the clergy of a godless age, presiding over a dreamscape of their own making, rewriting our language and traditions as they go along." Unquote. And that is a striking comparison to the world we're living in now. But before we accept Doyle's metaphor as the New Puritans wholesale, let's remember who the real Puritans were. Because of all of our overemphasis on what was wrong with the Puritans, we tend to forget all of the good they did. They built the first public schools in New England, pushed for universal literacy, founded Harvard, and pioneered self-governance. They were essential figures in the American story, which makes the real question more pressing. How could a community like this collapse into the madness of Salem?
I start and end the book with Salem, and the reason for that is I find a lot of parallels between what happened in Salem, Massachusetts in the late 17th century and what is occurring now with this ideology, which I see as a kind of a form of hysteria. So it is an allusion to the Puritans of New England in that respect, is that I think it is largely maintained. I mean, no one's getting hanged, right? But they are having their reputations ruined, their jobs destroyed. You know, there's a lot at stake because of accusations that are not evidence-based. So whereas the girls would shout witch, a modern day equivalent would shout turf, or racist, homophobe, fascist, Nazi, all of these slurs that we see endlessly bandied about. And we've reached a point where the accusation is taken as proof. That's similar as to what happened in Salem. Similarly, all of the prosecutions in Salem were secured on what they called spectral evidence. In other words, I, the accuser, see this thing and interpret it in this way, and therefore that is evidence of what I am saying. We call that lived experience. You hear that phrase, lived experience, all the time. This is my lived experience. This is how I've perceived this event. I have perceived that the way that you have interacted with me comes from a homophobic stance, and therefore that is sufficient evidence for something to occur as a result, or for you to be penalized in some way. So I was trying to draw those sorts of comparisons. I think the reason why it bears and merits a sort of analogy is that Salem only really happened because of the people in authority, the magistrates and the ministers capitulating to what the girls were saying. So all of these screaming activists would go away, but they have somehow, over the past 12 years maximum, cultivated incredible clout within our society. They occupy major positions of influence in all of our major institutions, civic institutions, public institutions, the law, the judiciary, the police, schools certainly, higher education most definitely. That's where a lot of it comes from. And they can be vicious, and they can seek to attack and demean anyone who dissents from their point of view, or more importantly, anyone who challenges their worldview. And if the people in authority just said, come on, this is hysteria, we're not going along with it, I think it would dissipate, but they don't. And in Salem, the consequences of that were 20 dead. Today, the consequences of that are a climate of generalized fear amongst the population about what should or should not be said, or how things will be interpreted, and what we call cancel culture, which, you know, for all I hear that it doesn't exist, it has managed to pile up a hell of a lot of casualties, which would suggest that it does.
And that's exactly what we saw in Salem. What happened there mirrors the same psychological forces that drive cults. Unprovable assumptions treated as truth, fear replacing reason, rigid virtue cues, and coercive control running rampant. As moral certainty hardened into hysteria, ordinary people fell silent under the pressure of those claiming authority to define or redefine reality itself. That's the danger Andrew Doyle warns about in The New Puritans. It isn't that today's activists wear bonnets or quote scripture, although arguably they do their own version of all of this, but I digress.
Shame! 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 Our choice!
It's that they've revived the same moral machinery, the same belief in the perfectibility of man, the same desire for control, the same faith for accusation, the same zeal for punishing heresy in the name of righteousness. Because when emotion overrides evidence and conscience bows to conformity, the witch hunt never really ends. It just finds new sets of sinners to burn.
The experiment you'll be taking part in today involves the perception of lengths of lines. As you can see here, I have a number of cards, and on each card there are several lines. Your task is a very simple one. You're to look at the line on the left and determine which of the three lines on the right is equal to it in length. You'll give your answer.
Only one of the people in the group is a real subject, the fifth person with the white t-shirt. The others are confederates of the experimenter and have been told to give wrong answers on some of the trials. The experiment begins uneventfully as subjects give their judgments. But on the third trial, something happens. The subject denies the evidence of his own eyes and yields to group influence. But he found through interviews that they went along with the group for different reasons.
One. They must be right. There are four of them and one of me.
One. This subject's yielding is based on a distortion of his judgment. He genuinely believes that the group is correct.
I know they're wrong, but why should I make waves?
Two. In this case, the subject knows he is right, but goes along to avoid the discomfort of disagreeing with the group. The partnership variation shows that much of the power of the group came not merely from its numbers, but from the unanimity of its opposition. When that unanimity is punctured, the group's power is greatly reduced. Sometimes we go along with the group because what they say convinces us they are right. This is called informational conformity. But sometimes we conform because we are apprehensive that the group will disapprove if we are deviant. This is called normative conformity. The strength of the normative factor is shown in another variation carried out by Asch. Asch's experiment is a classic. It reveals how people will deny what they see and submit to group pressure. It allows us not only to observe conformity, but to study the conditions that increase or reduce its occurrence.
What you just saw was Solomon Asch's famous conformity experiment from the 1950s, where most participants denied the evidence they saw with their own eyes and even lied to the person interviewing them just to agree with a group of strangers they knew were wrong. They weren't brainwashed or insane, they were simply human. That's how vulnerable we all are to social pressure. Add a few common factors like trauma, loneliness, unhealed wounds, exposure to smear campaigns or propaganda, and it's easy to see how ordinary people can get swept up into mass manipulation without even realizing it. Cults don't necessarily need magic or hypnosis to succeed. Just a good old dose of peer pressure and we can fold like a lawn chair. This experiment showed us that even without much provocation, it's easy for us to start doubting our own perceptions just to stay in right standing with the collective, even when we don't know any of them and the stakes are low. In spite of the fact that Asch's experiment was clearly temporary, the mind still processed the dynamic in the same way. Belonging felt like reward and exile felt like a threat. Now imagine if the stakes were real, if the loss of your community, your reputation, or even your life were truly on the line for going against the crowd. That's the kind of fear that gripped Salem. When acceptance or survival itself depends on conformity, even conformity to lies, truth becomes negotiable for the sake of self-protection. When totally subjective evidence like dreams, feelings, or invisible crimes were accepted as fact, people learned to doubt their own eyes to protect themselves. The part that chills me most is realizing that this wasn't possession or madness. It was groupthink, the same psychological currents that can run through any cult or movement, even the ones that begin with good intentions. It's tempting to paint history in broad strokes, to see the Puritans as villains, to flatten entire people into their worst moment. I mean, I almost did as I was writing this episode. But I realized, thanks to notes from a friend, that when we do this, we miss something vital. This could have been us. Because that same impulse, denying reality to appease the group, or even just to feed our own sense of self-righteousness, still creeps into our time. Once we surrender discernment and truth for acceptance, or a more explicit sense of safety, manipulation and exploitation don't have to force their way in. We open the door ourselves. And maybe that's the real warning in all this. The danger isn't just that history repeats, but that psychological patterns do. And they live in all of us. We've always known Salem is a mirror, but instead of projecting our own ideas onto it, maybe it's time to ask what it's been trying to reflect back to us. My fear is that in our effort to prove we're nothing like the villains of history, we've failed to see ourselves in them. And that's exactly how we will end up becoming them in a new story.
Excuse me, are y'all with the cult?
We're not a cult. We're an organization that promotes love and...
Yeah, this is it.